Fight of the American Eagles by Roger G. Trow. Prologue. In 2050 there was a cataclysmic series of seismic events which shook the very governments and institutions of society. In the ensuing chaos, dictators arose in Europe and China, and under their totalitarian regimes all personal liberties were lost. But the world looked on in amazement to see the home of democracy also brought down to its knees. A man arose in the dark hour to rally America, and he called for a return to the old values which had made it a great nation. Since the North American countries had all suffered a need to rebuild, he called upon the three states to unite. So in 2052, Tyler led the way to unification. With a sense of common purpose, America, Canada, and Mexico united to form the Union of the Americas. Soon afterwards, the President, Benjamin Tyler, declared martial law to quell the rioting and disorder throughout the Union and re-establish peace by a repressive dictatorship under the banner of the Freedom Party. The people had not consented to a dictatorship and expected a benevolent and paternal leadership, but the declaration of emergency powers merely brought into effect laws which had been introduced gradually through the decades by executive orders, which handed full powers to an unelected body, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, otherwise known as FEMA. FEMA had been handed sweeping powers to establish a police state, and the military enforced the policing of the regulations. They were opposed by small groups who acted clandestinely to overthrow the government and wipe out the ruling Freedom Party. Gradually, these small groups united to form a national movement, under the leadership of Dwayne Richards. The struggle was long and bitter. It had already continued for 4 decades. The government had technology and power, but the people had the will to resist. The resistance called themselves the American Eagles. As a result of the defeats inflicted upon him by the American Eagles, President Ben Tyler had taken his own life. He was succeeded by an even crueler man, Arturo Sanchez. Sanchez was hand in hand with the Mexican drug cartels, and under his vice presidency he had encouraged a floodtide of drugs into the society, and in anticipation of assuming the presidency, he had prepared even harsher repression for the citizens of the Union. In his greed for power, he came head-on against the real power brokers, a shadowy group called the Olympians. The American Eagles fostered their mutual distrust and animosity, so that the Mexicans and the Olympians met in a clash to decide who would rule the Union. Having thus drawn both parties into the same hotel in Boston, the American Eagles detonated a series of charges which killed them all. The struggle continues against their successors. Chapter 1. David Macintosh and his friend Nick had opted to join the resistance movement. There were few choices anyway, perhaps 3. They could have joined the American Eagles in their rebellion, or sat back and waited for the government of the Union of the Americas to take away what few liberties remained after 40 years of martial law, or even to sell out and become collaborators. The third option was not even to be considered by any honest man, and the second seemed highly improbable to have a good outcome. You might say that the degree of freedom for their choice, in all practicality, was reduced to one course. Every week, it seemed, the government of Ian Sharpe issued new decrees aimed at tightening central control over the population. The civilian population of the Americas were corralled into their cities, and not allowed any of the personal freedoms that their fathers had taken so much for granted. Martial law gave the military absolute power of arrest, and the courts were subjugated to the authority of the regional military commanders. The rule of law was nominally subject to the Emergency Powers Bill, but in practice it was arbitrary, and the court's judgments were meaningless. Sharpe had come to power following the deaths of his predecessors, Presidents Ben Tyler and Arturo Sanchez. Tyler had committed suicide, while Sanchez had been assassinated along with the entire board of the Olympians. Sharpe, however, was a more prudent man. He had bided his time and allowed Tyler and Sanchez to build the system that established the Freedom Party in complete control over the Americas. They had made their mistakes, and it had cost them their lives. Tyler had allowed the American Eagles to take a strategic advantage in a guerrilla war, and, in so doing, he earned the displeasure of his paymasters, the Olympians. His successor, Arturo Sanchez, had also crossed the Olympians by trespassing upon their business interests, mainly the drug trade, but also he had disrespected them and tried to usurp their strategy for the New World Order. Ian Sharpe had no doubt that the American Eagles had been responsible for the assassinations, since it suited their aims to remove both parties. He deduced that there was no one else, except possibly himself, to benefit.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?